201 million years ago, the Earth was turning through a profound and lingering silence, a quietude etched not in the absence of sound, but in the scarcity of its sources. The planet was breathing after a fever, the great paroxysm of the Triassic-Jurassic extinction event, a planetary convulsion that had emptied the world. This was not the aftermath of a sudden impact, a singular, catastrophic punctuation mark in the geological sentence, but the drawn-out denouement of a world choked by its own inner fire. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, a vast volcanic outpouring that stitched the heart of the supercontinent Pangaea with fissures and flood basalts, had hemorrhaged carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere for millennia, acidifying the oceans and driving the climate into a violent, unpredictable state of extreme heat. Now, in the earliest moments of the period that would later be named Jurassic, the echoes of that catastrophe defined every landscape. The air, thick with carbon dioxide at concentrations perhaps 5 times that of the modern, pre-industrial world, held a damp, heavy heat close to the surface, creating a global hothouse where the very concept of a polar ice cap was a physical impossibility. The sun, a familiar star in a sky of unfamiliar constellations, would have risen over a world painted in muted tones of red, ochre, and the resilient green of the planet's most tenacious flora. Pangaea itself, the single great landmass that had defined the terrestrial world for 100 million years, persisted as a geographic reality, a C-shaped continent straddling the equator. But it was a union under immense strain, a tectonic entity beginning to groan and stretch under the deep, slow pull of mantle convection. To the east, the Tethys Sea, a vast, warm, triangular ocean, pressed westward into the continent's maw, its waters already beginning to trace the future shorelines of southern Europe and northern Africa. Surrounding this colossal landmass was the single, planet-spanning ocean, Panthalassa, an expanse of water so vast that its horizons were not merely curved by the planet's circumference but defined by a sense of near-infinite emptiness, its abyssal plains holding the cold, oxygen-poor water of a world with sluggish oceanic circulation. The interior of Pangaea was a domain of profound aridity, a continental desert larger than any that exists today, where dune seas of oxidized sand marched across landscapes baked by a relentless sun. Seasonal monsoons, driven by the extreme temperature differential between the supercontinent and the global ocean, brought violent, short-lived rains to its coastal margins, carving deep, ephemeral river channels and feeding vast, shallow lakes that would evaporate into salt pans under the long, dry seasons. This was a world of extremes, a planet of continental deserts and humid, storm-racked coastlines, with little temperate gradation in between. Life, having passed through the crucible of extinction, was now engaged in a slow, tentative process of reclamation. The grand dynasties of the Triassic were gone, the Crurotarsans, those diverse crocodile-line archosaurs that had dominated the land, were largely swept away, leaving behind their more adaptable, water-oriented cousins, the crocodilomorphs. Into the void stepped the dinosaurs. They were not yet the titans of popular imagination but were instead small, nimble, bipedal creatures, theropods whose light-boned skeletons and efficient, bird-like respiratory systems had perhaps given them an edge in the oxygen-poor atmosphere of the extinction's peak. Alongside them were the early sauropodomorphs, creatures like Plateosaurus and its kin, already experimenting with herbivory and increased size, their longer necks allowing them to browse on vegetation inaccessible to others. In the shadows and the undergrowth, the first true mammals, tiny, shrew-like creatures, scurried through a world that was not yet theirs, their warm-blooded metabolism and nocturnal habits a legacy of survival in a world ruled by reptiles. The vegetation itself was a testament to resilience. The great seed fern forests of the Triassic had withered, and in their place grew vast, monotonous expanses of spore-producing plants. Ferns, horsetails, and lycophytes carpeted the damp lowlands, while the hardier, drought-resistant cycads and bonetitalians, with their thick, palm-like trunks and whorls of stiff, leathery leaves, clung to the drier uplands. Conifers, the ancestors of future forests, were present but not yet dominant, their woody forms a promise of the vertical world to come. In the seas, the recovery was similarly cautious. The complex reef ecosystems had collapsed, and the shallow sea floors were often bare mud, punctuated by the coiled shells of the few ammonite species that had survived, their rapid evolutionary radiation a clear signal of ecological opportunity. The great marine reptiles, the ichthyosaurs, had weathered the storm, their streamlined bodies once again slicing through the Tethyan waters, hunting the newly evolving clades of bony fish. This was the foundation of the Jurassic, a wounded world, an emptied world, yet a world pregnant with potential, its silence not an ending, but the deep, indrawn breath before a new aeon of life would begin, an era defined not by recovery, but by an unparalleled explosion of scale and form, all beginning on the shores of a continent that was starting, inexorably, to tear itself apart. Beneath the recovering ecosystems and the greenhouse atmosphere, the deep forces that had triggered the end-Triassic crisis were continuing their work, not with the violent paroxysms of flood basalt volcanism, but with a slow, relentless stretching of the Earth's crust. The supercontinent of Pangaea was not a static jigsaw puzzle of continental plates, it was a temporary configuration, and the heat building beneath its thick, insulating lithosphere was seeking escape. This escape manifested as a great rift system, a network of nascent cracks and fault lines extending for thousands of kilometers, tracing a path from the northern reaches of the nascent Atlantic down through the continent's center. This was the true birth of the Atlantic Ocean, not as a recognizable body of water, but as a geological process of immense scale and duration. Imagine a landscape in modern-day Eastern Africa, the Great Rift Valley, with its steep-sided escarpments, its deep, alkaline lakes, and its simmering volcanoes, and then stretch that vision across a continent, amplifying its scale by an order of magnitude. This was the heart of early Jurassic Pangaea. The land was being pulled apart, thinning like heated wax, and as it thinned, blocks of crust subsided between parallel faults, creating vast, linear depressions known as grabens. These rift valleys became the defining feature of the region, deep scars on the face of the supercontinent, each one a future ocean basin in embryonic form. These valleys were not empty chasms. They became the focal point for the planet's hydrology, capturing rainfall from the monsoonal coasts and channeling it into enormous, elongated lakes. These were not the clear, fresh waters of modern temperate lakes, they were often highly saline, fed by rivers carrying immense loads of dissolved minerals leached from the volcanically active highlands that flanked the rifts. In the arid climate, evaporation was intense, concentrating these salts and creating bizarre chemical environments. Layers of sediment accumulating at the bottom of these lakes would record this process, forming thick sequences of rock containing salt and gypsum deposits, interspersed with layers of black, organic-rich shale laid down during wetter periods when the lakes deepened and stratified, their bottom waters becoming anoxic and preserving any life that fell into them with exquisite detail. The volcanism associated with this rifting was persistent. While the cataclysmic flood basalts of the camp had ceased, smaller-scale eruptions continued to punctuate the landscape. Fissures would open, venting steam and noxious gases, while shield volcanoes built up slowly from repeated flows of fluid basaltic lava, their dark, basaltic rock weathering into the iron-rich red soils that gave the continental interior its characteristic hue. The very air would have carried the faint, acrid smell of sulfur, a constant reminder of the planet's internal heat engine driving the transformation of its surface. This immense geological upheaval had profound consequences for the global ocean, culminating in one of the most severe marine crises of the Jurassic, the Torsion Oceanic Anoxic event, occurring around 183 million years ago. The renewed pulse of volcanism associated with the Carufera Large Igneous Province in the southern hemisphere, coupled with the weathering of the newly exposed rock in the rift valleys, released vast quantities of nutrients and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere and oceans. This triggered a cascade of effects. The increased CO2 amplified the already potent greenhouse effect, raising global temperatures and further warming the surface waters of the ocean. This warming reduced the ocean's ability to hold dissolved oxygen and, critically, weakened the global oceanic conveyor belt, the system of currents that transports cold, oxygen-rich water from the poles to the deep ocean. Simultaneously, the flood of nutrients from the continents led to massive algal blooms in the surface waters. When these algae died, they sank, and their decomposition by bacteria consumed what little oxygen remained in the deeper water columns. The result was a world where vast swathes of the ocean became stratified and anoxic, or even euxinic, rich in poisonous hydrogen sulfide. On the seafloor, under these stagnant, toxic waters, black, laminated shales accumulated, burying immense amounts of organic carbon and creating the petroleum source rocks that power modern industrial civilization. For the marine life of the torsion, it was a catastrophe. Many species of ammonites, bivalves, and ichthyosaurs went extinct. The seafloor communities were devastated. Yet, as with all extinctions, this crisis was also a creative force. It cleared the way for new lineages to radiate, new forms to evolve into the vacated niches, ensuring that the marine ecosystems of the Middle and Late Jurassic would be built upon the foundations of this early, fiery reorganization of the world. The tearing of the land was inextricably linked to the poisoning of the sea, a powerful demonstration of the Earth as a single, interconnected system, where the slow grind of tectonics could dictate the very chemistry of life itself. As the rifting continued and the continents pulled away from one another, the narrow rift valleys widened and deepened, eventually breaching sea level and allowing the warm, saline waters of the Tethys to flood in. The nascent Central Atlantic Ocean was born, a long, restricted seaway separating the newly formed continents of Laurasia to the north and Gondwana to the south. This event, unfolding over millions of years during the Middle Jurassic, fundamentally re-engineered the planet's climate system. The vast, arid interior of Pangaea, once thousands of kilometers from the nearest source of oceanic moisture, was now bordered by a growing body of water. This new ocean, along with the ever-widening Tethys Seaway that connected it to the Panthalassic Ocean, acted as an enormous solar heat reservoir and a source of atmospheric humidity. The extreme continentality that had defined the Triassic and early Jurassic began to break down. The planet's climate, while still a potent greenhouse with no permanent ice, became less a world of binary extremes, parched desert and monsoonal coast, and more a world of gradients, with increased rainfall penetrating further into the continental interiors. This profound climatic shift fostered an explosion of life, transforming the terrestrial landscape into a far lusher, greener, and more stable world than had existed before. The most dramatic evidence of this change was the proliferation of shallow, epicontinental seas. As global sea levels rose, driven by the thermal expansion of seawater and the displacement of ocean water by the growing mid-ocean ridges, vast areas of the low-lying continental interiors were inundated. In North America, the Sundance Sea advanced and retreated, a warm, shallow arm of the Panthalassic Ocean that covered much of the western part of the continent. In Europe, a complex archipelago formed, with islands of ancient continental crust separated by seaways teeming with life. These shallow seas were biological powerhouses. Warmed by the Jurassic sun, their sunlit waters fostered the growth of immense reef systems. These were not yet the fast-growing scleractinian corals that dominate modern reefs. Instead, they were often built by a bizarre assemblage of sponges, bivalves, and microbial mats, creating complex, three-dimensional habitats that supported a staggering diversity of other organisms. The waters swarmed with ammonites, their shells evolving into an incredible array of shapes and sizes, from tightly coiled discs to uncoiled, corkscrew-like forms. Belemnites, ancient relatives of squid, hunted in vast shoals, their fossilized, bullet-shaped internal shells littering the seafloor. And patrolling these vibrant ecosystems were the marine reptiles, now more diverse than ever, with plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs joined by marine crocodiles that had adapted to a fully aquatic lifestyle. On land, the increased humidity and more stable rainfall patterns allowed for the expansion of vast forests. The flora of the Jurassic was fundamentally alien to a modern eye, a world dominated not by the familiar angiosperms, the flowering plants, but by gymnosperms. Towering conifers, related to modern araucaria, monkey puzzle trees, and podocarps, formed the canopy of these forests, their straight, columnar trunks rising to great heights. The Chirolepidiaceae, an extinct family of conifers, were particularly successful, their drought-resistant foliage allowing them to thrive in a wide range of environments. The understory was a dense, primeval tangle of ferns, some growing to the size of trees, their fronds unfurling in the dappled light. Cycads and the similar-looking Benedictalians were everywhere, their stout, armored trunks and crowns of stiff, pinnate leaves giving the landscape a strange, almost sculpted appearance. Ginkgos, with their distinctive fan-shaped leaves, lined the riverbanks. What was entirely absent was color as we know it in a floral sense. There were no petals, no blossoms, no bright hues designed to attract insect pollinators. The world was a symphony in green and brown. It sensed the resinous perfume of conifers and the damp, earthy smell of decaying ferns. There was no fruit, no nectar, only the starchy seeds and tough, fibrous foliage that fueled the ecosystems. It was in these humid, sprawling, conifer-dominated forests that the dinosaurs, beneficiaries of a more productive and stable world, truly began their ascent, their evolution now set on a trajectory towards gigantism, a path made possible by the sheer, planetary scale increase in vegetative biomass that this new, warmer, and wetter world provided. The breakup of a supercontinent was not just a geological event, it was the fertilization of a planet. Within these vast, humid forests of the Middle and Late Jurassic, a new evolutionary dynasty rose to a level of dominance never seen before or since. The sauropod dinosaurs, which had their humble origins in the Triassic, now embarked on an inexorable march towards gigantism, becoming the largest terrestrial animals that have ever lived. To comprehend the scale of a creature like Brachiosaurus or Diplodocus is to challenge the limits of biological imagination. An adult Brachiosaurus, standing with its head held high, could have peered over a 5-story building, its body weighing as much as a dozen elephants. A Diplodocus, though more lightly built, was extraordinarily long, stretching over 30 meters from the tip of its snout to the end of its whip-like tail, the length of 3 school buses placed end to end. These were not mere animals, they were walking ecosystems, mobile geological forces whose very existence fundamentally altered the landscapes they inhabited. Their lives began as something impossibly small, an egg, laid in a clutch in a shallow depression scraped from the soil, no larger than a modern ostrich egg. From a hatchling perhaps a meter long and weighing only a few kilograms, the young sauropod embarked on a period of explosive growth, a biological race against mortality. To survive, it had to reach a size that would deter the formidable predators of its time, a feat that required it to gain tens of kilograms every single day for the first decades of its life. This incredible scale was made possible by a suite of sophisticated anatomical and physiological adaptations. Their bones, particularly the vertebrae of their long necks and torsos, were not solid structures. They were hollowed out by a complex network of air sacs, extensions of their respiratory system, a feature they shared with modern birds. This pneumatic system, known as postcranial skeletal pneumaticity, drastically reduced the weight of their skeletons without compromising their strength, allowing them to support such immense frames. Their respiratory system itself was a model of efficiency, with lungs that likely functioned with a one-way flow of air, again similar to birds, enabling them to extract a higher percentage of oxygen from the air, a crucial advantage in the Jurassic atmosphere, which may have had lower oxygen concentrations than today's. Their necks, the most iconic feature of the group, were marvels of biological engineering, composed of intricately articulating vertebrae and supported by a complex system of ligaments and muscles. The long-standing image of them holding their necks aloft like giraffes has been debated, with biomechanical models suggesting many, like Diplodocus, held their necks more horizontally, sweeping them from side to browse on low to medium-height vegetation over a wide area without moving their enormous bodies. Others, like Brachiosaurus, with their longer front limbs and upwardly sloping backs, were clearly adapted for high browsing, reaching the tops of the tallest conifers. The ecological impact of these creatures was profound. They were the first true high browsers in Earth's history, and their feeding habits would have sculpted the very structure of the forests. A herd of sauropods moving through a woodland would have been a force of nature, clearing away the understory, toppling smaller trees, and creating open, park-like savannas dotted with mature trees whose canopies were beyond their reach. This process, often termed ecosystem engineering, would have created new habitats for smaller herbivores and influenced the evolutionary trajectory of the plants themselves, favoring species that could grow quickly to escape the sauropod browsing zone or those that possessed strong chemical defenses. Their metabolism, a subject of ongoing scientific debate, was likely somewhere between the slow, cold-blooded metabolism of a modern reptile and the high, warm-blooded metabolism of a mammal or bird. Even with a relatively moderate metabolic rate, the sheer thermal inertia of their massive bodies would have maintained a high and stable core temperature. The digestive process alone, fermenting vast quantities of tough, fibrous plant matter in their enormous gut cavities, would have generated a significant amount of heat. As a byproduct of this fermentation, they would have released colossal amounts of methane, a potent greenhouse gas, into the atmosphere, potentially contributing, in a small but measurable way, to the warmth of the Jurassic climate. The reign of the sauropods was a testament to the productivity of the Jurassic world, a period where a stable, warm climate and abundant vegetation provided the perfect crucible for life to experiment with the absolute upper limits of size on land. The existence of such immense herbivores, moving in great herds across the floodplains and through the conifer forests, created a powerful selective pressure for the evolution of equally formidable predators. The Late Jurassic, particularly in the fossil-rich ecosystem preserved as the Morrison Formation of North America, was the golden age of the giant carnivorous dinosaurs, the large theropods. These were not the brutish, slow-moving monsters of early reconstructions, but highly adapted, dynamic predators, the product of tens of millions of years of evolutionary refinement. The most famous and abundant of these was Allosaurus, a carnivore that perfectly balanced size, speed, and weaponry. An adult Allosaurus could reach lengths of 9 to 12 meters and weigh over 2 tons, a bipedal hunter of terrifying efficiency. Its skull was a masterpiece of engineering, appearing massive but composed of light, fenestrated bones, strong enough to withstand the stresses of a powerful bite, yet light enough for rapid movement. Its teeth were long, curved, and serrated like steak knives, designed not for crushing bone but for slicing through flesh, inflicting deep, bleeding wounds. Its arms, though small relative to its body, were robust and tipped with 3 large, recurved claws, likely used for gripping and tearing at prey. The world as perceived by an Allosaurus would have been a landscape of sensory information geared towards the hunt. Its large, side-facing eyes would have provided a wide field of vision, excellent for spotting the movement of potential prey, while its large olfactory bulbs, inferred from the size of the corresponding region of its brain case, suggest a keen sense of smell, allowing it to track herds or locate carcasses from a distance. The Morrison environment it inhabited was a vast, semi-arid floodplain, characterized by long dry seasons where water and vegetation would become scarce, concentrating both herbivores and the carnivores that hunted them around the shrinking rivers and waterholes. This seasonal stress would have created a brutal, competitive arena. Fossil evidence from the Morrison Formation paints a vivid picture of this life. The bones of sauropods and stegosaurs are frequently found bearing the unmistakable serrated bite marks of Allosaurus. Conversely, the skeletons of allosaurs themselves show a high frequency of healed injuries, broken ribs, stress fractures, and deep gouges, some of which match the teeth and claws of other allosaurs, suggesting violent, intraspecific combat over territory, mates, or kills. Allosaurus was not alone at the top of the food chain. It shared its environment with other large predators, each likely occupying a slightly different ecological niche. Torvosaurus, a megalosaurid, was even larger and more robustly built than Allosaurus, with a deeper, more powerful skull and shorter, thicker teeth, suggesting it may have specialized in tackling the largest and most challenging prey, perhaps ambushing juvenile or subadult sauropods. At the other end of the scale was Ceratosaurus, a smaller, more primitive theropod distinguished by the prominent horn on its snout and a pair of crests over its eyes. It may have specialized in smaller prey or acted as a scavenger, avoiding direct competition with its larger relatives. The hunting strategies of these animals were likely varied. While a single Allosaurus could certainly kill a medium-sized ornithopod or a stegosaur, the challenge of bringing down a fully grown sauropod would have been immense. This has led to speculation about pack hunting behavior, a coordinated attack by multiple individuals to overwhelm the defenses of these colossal herbivores. While direct evidence for this remains elusive, the concentration of multiple Allosaurus skeletons at sites like the Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry in Utah hints at some form of sociality, though it could equally represent a predator trap where individuals were drawn to and became mired while scavenging. The late Jurassic terrestrial ecosystem was thus a dynamic and violent theater of coevolution, an arms race between the ever-increasing size and defensive armor of the herbivores and the ever more lethal adaptations of the carnivores that stalked them through the fern savannas and riverine forests. While the dinosaurs were achieving their spectacular dominance on land, the vast marine realms of the Jurassic were home to a completely different, yet equally impressive, dynasty of reptiles that had returned to the sea. The Tethys Ocean and the Great Panthalassa were not empty expanses but complex, multi-layered ecosystems ruled by air-breathing predators whose adaptations to aquatic life were profound. To plunge beneath the surface of a Jurassic sea would be to enter a world both familiar and alien. The water was warm, and in the shallows over the great carbonate platforms, it would have been crystal clear, with sunlight filtering down to illuminate sponge reefs and thickets of crinoids, the sea lilies that waved on their long stalks like strange, feathery flowers. Shoals of bony fish, belonging to groups now long extinct, would have shimmered in the light, alongside coiled ammonites propelling themselves backward by jetting water from their siphons. But it was the great reptiles that commanded this world, representing the pinnacle of marine evolution at the time. Among the most conspicuous were the plesiosaurs, a diverse group characterized by their broad, turtle-like bodies and powerful, oar-like flippers. They were divided into two primary lineages with starkly different body plans and ecological roles. The plesiosauromorphs were the classic long-necked forms, epitomized by creatures with necks that could contain dozens of vertebrae, sometimes exceeding the length of their body and tail combined. The function of this extraordinary neck has long been debated. It was likely too stiff for the swan-like, serpentine striking motion often depicted. Instead, it may have allowed these animals to hang motionless in the water column, a cryptic predator using its small head and needle-like teeth to ambush schools of fish and squid from below, or to browse for soft-bodied invertebrates on the seafloor without disturbing the sediment with its large body. Their method of swimming was unique, a form of underwater flight using all four flippers in a powerful, figure-eight motion to generate thrust. In contrast, the pliosaurs were the apex predators of the Jurassic seas. These were short-necked plesiosaurs built for power and speed, possessing massive skulls armed with enormous, conical teeth. A giant like Pliosaurus or Liopleurodon was the marine equivalent of Tyrannosaurus rex, an ambush predator of immense size and strength. With a skull over 2 meters long and a bite force that likely dwarfed that of any living animal, they were capable of hunting and dismembering other large marine reptiles, including ichthyosaurs and smaller plesiosaurs, as evidenced by fossil bones bearing their deep, puncturing tooth marks. Sharing these waters were the ichthyosaurs, the fish lizards, which represented one of the most remarkable cases of convergent evolution in the history of life. Though descended from land-dwelling reptiles, their bodies had become perfectly streamlined and dolphin-like, with a powerful, crescent-shaped tail fin for propulsion, dorsal fins for stability, and pectoral flippers for steering. Their skulls were elongated into a slender, toothed beak, ideal for snapping up fish and belemnites. Perhaps their most striking feature was their enormous eyes, the largest relative to body size of any animal known, protected by a ring of bony plates called the sclerotic ring. These huge eyes suggest they were adapted for hunting in deep or low-light conditions, perhaps diving to great depths in pursuit of squid, or hunting at dawn and dusk. Fossil evidence has provided an incredible window into their biology, with some specimens preserved giving birth, revealing that they bore live young, tail first like modern cetaceans, having severed all reproductive ties to the land. The Jurassic oceans were a complete and self-contained world, a three-dimensional arena where these magnificent reptiles played out their lives. Their ecosystem was supported by a rich food web, from the plankton at the base to the colossal, filter-feeding bony fish Leadsichthys, which grew to lengths exceeding 16 meters, swimming through the water with its mouth agape, sieving out small prey. This intricate marine biosphere, isolated from the terrestrial world by the boundary of the shore, was a parallel stage for the drama of life, governed by its own rules of predation, adaptation, and extinction. As the continents divided and the oceans teemed with reptilian giants, a third great theater of life was being conquered, the sky. Long before the first birds, another group of archosaurs, the pterosaurs, had achieved powered flight, filling the skies of the Mesozoic for over 150 million years. The Jurassic was a period of great diversification for these winged reptiles, seeing the flourishing of early forms and the emergence of the lineage that would later produce the largest flying creatures of all time. The pterosaur wing was a biological marvel, fundamentally different from that of birds or bats. It was formed by a membrane of skin and muscle, the patagium, stretched between the side of the body, the legs, and a dramatically elongated fourth finger of the hand. This created a large, flexible airfoil, supported internally by a network of unique, closely packed fibers called actinofibrils, which provided stiffness and prevented tearing. Their bones were hollow and air-filled, like those of their dinosaur cousins and modern birds, creating a skeleton that was both lightweight and strong, a prerequisite for flight. Many pterosaur fossils are also preserved with an insulating coat of hair-like filaments called pycnofibers, a clear indication that they were active, warm-blooded animals, capable of generating the sustained metabolic energy required for powered flight. During the Jurassic, pterosaurs were broadly categorized into two major groups. The earlier, more primitive forms were the rhamphorhynchoids, a paraphyletic group characterized by their long, bony tails, which were often tipped with a diamond-shaped vein that likely acted as a rudder for stability and steering. A typical example, Rhamphorhynchus, from the late Jurassic of Germany, was a coastal fish-eater, with a long snout filled with sharp, forward-pointing teeth perfect for snagging slippery prey from the water's surface. Another, Dimorphodon, from the early Jurassic, had a strangely deep, puffin-like skull and two distinct types of teeth, suggesting a different diet, perhaps insects or small terrestrial vertebrates. These long-tailed pterosaurs were agile flyers, soaring over the Tethyan lagoons and coastlines, sharing the air with prehistoric dragonflies and other large insects. Towards the end of the Jurassic, a new group emerged, the pterodactyloids. These were the more advanced pterosaurs, distinguished by their much shorter tails and longer, more slender skulls and neck vertebrae. Pterodactylus itself, one of the first pterosaurs ever discovered, was a small, delicate creature from the late Jurassic Solnhofen limestone, with a long, tooth-filled beak. The emergence of the pterodactyloids marked a major evolutionary shift, and they would go on to dominate the skies of the Cretaceous period, diversifying into a huge array of forms, including the giant, toothless asdarchids. The ecological niches they occupied were varied. Some were clearly coastal piscivores, others likely insectivores that darted through the conifer forests. Their terrestrial locomotion has been a source of debate, but fossil trackways have confirmed that they walked quadrupedally, folding their long wing fingers back and using their front limbs as well as their hind legs to move about on the ground, a posture that would have looked utterly alien. But the skies of the late Jurassic were to witness another, profoundly significant evolutionary event. In the quiet, anoxic mud of a tropical lagoon in what is now Germany, the remains of Archaeopteryx were preserved. This creature was a perfect evolutionary mosaic, a missing link if ever there was one. It had beautifully preserved feathers, arranged on its wings into aerodynamic flight feathers just like a modern bird. It possessed a wishbone, or furcula, another key avian feature. Yet, it also retained a host of primitive, reptilian traits, a full set of small, sharp teeth in its beak, 3 distinct, clawed fingers on its hands, and a long, bony tail, with feathers emerging from each vertebra. Archaeopteryx was not a powerful flyer. It was likely a weak flapper, perhaps using its wings to assist in climbing or to glide for short distances between the low-lying islands of the Solnhofen archipelago. It represents a snapshot of evolution in action, the moment a lineage of small, feathered theropod dinosaurs began to experiment with the possibilities of the air, setting the stage for the rise of the birds, a group that would ultimately survive the extinction that wiped out their giant dinosaurian relatives and inherit the Earth. By the twilight of the Jurassic period, some 150 million years ago, the world was a mosaic of diverse and mature ecosystems, each shaped by the interplay of the slowly separating continents, the warm global climate, and the evolutionary dynasties that inhabited them. A transect across the globe would reveal a series of distinct, deeply textured landscapes, each with its own unique character. In the heart of Laurasia, the Morrison Formation environment of western North America presented a vast, seasonally arid floodplain. Here, broad, braided rivers meandered across the landscape, swelling into muddy torrents during the wet season and shrinking to a series of isolated pools during the long, dry months. Along the permanent watercourses grew lush gallery forests of tall conifers, ginkgos, and towering tree ferns, creating corridors of green that provided food and shelter for a spectacular menagerie of dinosaurs. Beyond these riverine forests, the landscape opened up into wide fern savannas, dotted with hardy cycads and benedictalians. This was the kingdom of the giants, herds of Diplodocus and Apatosaurus sweeping their long necks across the low-lying vegetation, the high-browsing Brachiosaurus and Camarasaurus feasting on the conifer canopy, and the heavily armored Stegosaurus, with its iconic plates and tail spikes, defending itself from the relentless predation of Allosaurus and Torvosaurus. Further east, across the young and narrow Atlantic, much of Europe was a shallow tropical sea, dotted with an archipelago of islands. The most famous of these environments is preserved in the Solnhofen limestone of Germany. This was a series of quiet, hypersaline lagoons, separated from the open Tethys Sea by sponge and coral reefs. The water in these lagoons was so salty and stagnant that its bottom layers were anoxic, devoid of oxygen and scavengers. As a result, any organism that fell or was washed into the lagoon was buried in fine, carbonate mud and preserved with astonishing, almost photographic, detail. It is thanks to this unique preservational window that we have fossils of Archaeopteryx with its feathers intact, delicate pterosaurs with their wing membranes visible, and even the preserved outlines of soft-bodied jellyfish. The low-lying islands surrounding these lagoons were covered not in dense forest but in scrubby vegetation dominated by drought-resistant cycads, a landscape that would have been scoured by tropical storms moving in from the Tethys. In the southern hemisphere, the great continent of Gondwana was also beginning to show the strains of impending fragmentation. Climates here were generally more humid and temperate than in Laurasia, particularly at higher latitudes. The forests of Gondwana were dominated by different floral communities, with podocarp and araucarian conifers forming vast, cool, temperate rainforests. The understory still featured a rich diversity of ferns, but here the ancient lineage of the dicroidium seed ferns, survivors from the Triassic, still held on in some regions. The dinosaur faunas were also distinct, with different families of sauropods and theropods evolving in isolation. Even the polar regions, both north and south, were forested. Without permanent ice caps, these high-latitude environments would have experienced a cool to temperate climate, but one defined by an extreme seasonality of light, with months of continuous daylight in the summer and months of perpetual, twilight darkness in the winter. The plants that grew here, likely deciduous conifers and hardy ferns, would have had to be adapted to this polar night, becoming dormant for a large part of the year. Dinosaurs that inhabited these polar forests, such as the ornithopods and small theropods whose remains have been found in Australia, which was then located within the Antarctic Circle, would have needed special adaptations to survive the long, cold, dark winters, perhaps through hibernation or by undertaking long seasonal migrations. This global tapestry of the late Jurassic was a world at its peak, a planet of immense biological productivity and diversity, but it was a dynamic system, already being shaped by the inexorable geological and evolutionary forces that would lead it into the next great chapter of its history, the Cretaceous. Beneath the visible spectacle of Jurassic life, the titanic sauropods, the fearsome predators, the teeming oceans, operated a complex web of invisible engines, the great biogeochemical cycles that regulated the planet's climate and the very composition of its atmosphere and oceans. These were the fundamental processes that created the stable greenhouse conditions in which the era's unique flora and fauna could thrive. The most critical of these was the global carbon cycle. During the Jurassic, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was significantly higher than today, with estimates ranging from 1,200 to 2,000 parts per million, roughly 4 to 5 times pre-industrial levels. This elevated CO2 was the primary driver of the planet's warmth. The sources of this carbon were numerous. Ongoing volcanism, associated with the continued rifting of the continents and the formation of new mid-ocean ridges, steadily released CO2 and other gases from the Earth's mantle. The respiration of the planet's immense biomass, from the smallest microbe to the largest sauropod, contributed a constant flux of carbon to the atmosphere, as did the decomposition of the vast quantities of organic matter in the humid forests and wetlands. Balancing these sources were the planet's carbon sinks. Photosynthesis, carried out on a massive scale by the Jurassic forests and marine phytoplankton, drew down atmospheric CO2, converting it into organic matter. When these organisms died, a fraction of their carbon was buried in sediments before it could decompose, effectively sequestering it from the active cycle. This process, over millions of years, formed the great coal seams and petroleum source rocks of the Jurassic period. Another crucial sink was the weathering of silicate rocks on the continents. Carbon dioxide in the atmosphere dissolves in rainwater to form a weak carbonic acid. This acid rain falls on the land and slowly dissolves silicate minerals in rocks, a chemical reaction that consumes CO2 and releases calcium and bicarbonate ions into rivers. These ions are then carried to the oceans, where marine organisms use them to build their shells and skeletons of calcium carbonate. When these organisms die, their carbonate remains sink to the seafloor, forming limestone and locking away the atmospheric carbon in the geological record for eons. The warm, wet climate of the Jurassic likely accelerated this weathering process, creating a powerful negative feedback loop that helped to stabilize the climate over geological timescales, preventing a runaway greenhouse effect. The oxygen cycle was also markedly different. While a precise figure is difficult to obtain, most models suggest that atmospheric oxygen levels during the Jurassic were lower than the modern 21%, perhaps fluctuating between 15% and 18%. This relatively oxygen-poor environment would have had significant biological implications. It may help explain the evolutionary success of the dinosaurs and pterosaurs, whose highly efficient, bird-like respiratory systems with unidirectional airflow would have been far more effective at extracting oxygen than the more primitive, diaphragm-based bellows system of early mammals. Lower oxygen levels would also have affected the global fire regime. With less oxygen to fuel combustion, large-scale wildfires would have been less frequent and less intense than in the later, high-oxygen world of the Cretaceous, which may have influenced the evolution of plant communities. The chemistry of the oceans was also distinct. The Jurassic was a calcite sea period, a state driven by the rate of seafloor spreading at mid-ocean ridges. Slower spreading rates, as were likely present during parts of the Jurassic, result in ocean water that is relatively low in magnesium. In these conditions, calcium carbonate preferentially precipitates as the mineral calcite. This favored organisms that built their shells from calcite, such as oysters, certain types of plankton, and the rudest bivalves that were just beginning their evolutionary journey to become major reef builders. In contrast, today's aragonite sea favors organisms like modern corals, which build their skeletons from aragonite, a different crystal form of calcium carbonate. These invisible, interlocking cycles of carbon, oxygen, and marine chemistry formed the planetary life support system of the Jurassic, a dynamic equilibrium that persisted for tens of millions of years, creating a world that was, from a fundamental chemical standpoint, as alien as it was from a biological one. The long reign of the Jurassic did not end with a sudden, dramatic catastrophe. Unlike the fiery punctuation mark of the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, the transition into the subsequent Cretaceous period, around 145 million years ago, was a more subtle and protracted affair, a gradual turnover of dynasties driven by the Earth's own slow, internal rhythms of change. The world of the final Jurassic stage, the Tithonian, was a world in flux, its ecosystems already showing the signs of the transformations to come. The primary engine of this change was the continuing fragmentation of the supercontinents. The rifting that had begun in the early Jurassic was accelerating. In the south, the separation of Africa and South America was beginning in earnest, heralding the birth of the South Atlantic Ocean. India, Antarctica, and Australia were also beginning to pull away from each other, breaking Gondwana into smaller, increasingly isolated continental blocks. In the north, the Central Atlantic was widening into a mature ocean, pushing Laurasia further apart. This accelerated seafloor spreading displaced vast volumes of ocean water, leading to a slow but persistent rise in global sea levels. The shallow epicontinental seas expanded, flooding more of the continental lowlands, fragmenting terrestrial habitats, and creating barriers to migration that would drive vicariant evolution, fostering the development of unique faunas on each newly isolated landmass. These profound geographical changes triggered a cascade of ecological shifts. The iconic dinosaur communities of the late Jurassic began to wane. The stegosaurs, those strangely armored ornithischians that had been so successful, went into a steep decline, becoming rare and eventually disappearing from the fossil record in the early Cretaceous. The great sauropod faunas also underwent a major restructuring. The diplodocids and brachiosaurids that had dominated the Morrison ecosystem were largely replaced by a new, ascendant lineage, the titanosaurs. These were to become the dominant sauropods of the Cretaceous, particularly in the southern continents, adapting to a changing world and producing the very largest land animals of all time. Among the predators, the allosaurids remained successful, but new groups of theropods, like the spinosaurids and the carcharodontosaurids, were beginning to emerge, setting the stage for the next era's predator-prey dynamics. Perhaps the most significant, yet initially inconspicuous, change was occurring in the plant kingdom. Hidden in the understory of the vast gymnosperm forests, a new type of plant was making its first, tentative appearance in the fossil record, the angiosperms, or flowering plants. These earliest angiosperms were likely small, weedy plants, perhaps living in disturbed habitats like riverbanks. They possessed a revolutionary suite of adaptations: flowers to attract animal pollinators, enclosed ovules that would develop into protected seeds, and the ability to form fruit for seed dispersal. In the Tithonian, they were a minor, almost unnoticeable component of the global flora. But they represented a quiet, biological revolution that, over the course of the Cretaceous, would completely transform terrestrial ecosystems, leading to the coevolution of insects, birds, and mammals, and ultimately replacing the ancient gymnosperm-dominated world with the flowering world we know today. In the oceans, a similar turnover was underway. The ichthyosaurs, which had ruled the seas for so long, were in decline, facing increasing competition from the newly evolving teleost fish and new types of marine reptiles. The giant pliosaurs remained the apex predators for a time, but their dynasty was also approaching its end, to be succeeded in the Cretaceous by the giant mosasaurs. The Jurassic, therefore, did not simply stop, it gradually bled into the Cretaceous. The world at the end of the Tithonian was a legacy of all that had come before, a planet without a single supercontinent, its climate still warm and equitable, its lands and seas still dominated by reptiles. But the seeds of a new world had already been sown. The continental stage was being rearranged, the cast of evolutionary actors was changing, and the slow, inexorable processes of geological and biological change were pushing the Earth towards a future that would be just as spectacular, and just as alien, as the long, green, gigantic age that was now drawing to its quiet, unceremonious close. The fossils, those fragmented whispers from a lost world, are the only testament to its 56-million-year passage, a reminder of the planet's immense creative power and its indifferent, perpetual motion through deep time.